The dawn broke cold over Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, but Captain Jake "Whiskey" Morrison felt nothing. Not the tropical heat already building on the tarmac. Not the salt wind coming off the Pacific. Not even the ache in his ribs from sleeping in the cockpit of a beat-up TBF Avenger that wasn't even his. He sat on the wing, boots dangling, staring at the empty revetments where 12 planes had been parked yesterday morning. 12. Now there were 4. And only one of those could fly. The rest were scattered across 60 miles of ocean, torn apart by Mitsubishi Zeros in an ambush so perfect, so brutal, that Morrison had watched it happen from 15,000 feet while his radio screamed with voices that would never speak again. His squadron, VT-8, the Bloody Eights, had been sent to intercept a Japanese supply convoy. Intelligence said light fighter cover. 2, maybe 3 Zeros. They'd flown into 18. Morrison had been flying CAP, Combat Air Patrol, 5 miles north when the transmission came through. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, his voice tight, "Bandits! Bandits everywhere. We're bracketed." Then static. Then nothing. Morrison had pushed his Avenger into a dive, racing toward the coordinates, but by the time he arrived, there was only wreckage. Oil slicks. A life raft with no one in it. The Zeros were already gone, vanished into the clouds like ghosts. He'd circled for an hour, calling names into the radio. No one answered. Now, sitting on that wing with the sun climbing and the mechanics pretending not to look at him, Morrison clenched his jaw so hard his teeth hurt. 12 men. 12 friends. Danny Hairball Chen, who could land on a carrier in a typhoon. Rodriguez, who sang Sinatra in the cockpit. Kid Kowalski, 19 years old, who'd never even kissed a girl. Gone. And Morrison had done nothing. Captain. He turned. Chief Mechanic Randall stood below, grease-stained hands holding a clipboard. Randall was 50, maybe older, with a face like carved mahogany and eyes that had seen too many pilots not come back. "They're asking for you in the tower," Randall said quietly. Morrison didn't move. "Tell them I'm busy." "Sir." "I said I'm busy." Randall studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He started to walk away, then stopped. "You know what they're gonna tell you up there, don't you?" Morrison said nothing. "They're gonna ground you. Send you stateside. Combat fatigue, they'll call it. Maybe give you a medal, pat you on the back, and put you behind a desk in San Diego pushing papers while boys keep dying out here." Morrison's hands tightened into fists. Randall stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Or, you could do something about it." Morrison finally looked at him. "With what?" "I've got one functional Avenger, no squadron, and orders to stand down." "You've got more than that." Randall's eyes gleamed. "You've got her." He pointed across the field. Sitting alone in the far corner, camouflaged under netting, was a plane Morrison had never seen before. Sleek. Twin-engine. AP-38 Lightning frame, but modified, stripped down, lighter. No guns. No bombs. Just cameras and what looked like electronic equipment bolted to the wings. "What the hell is that?" "F-4, Randall said. Photo reconnaissance variant. Flew in 2 days ago with a tech crew from Naval Intelligence. They're testing some new radar jamming gear, experimental stuff. Supposed to make it invisible to Jap radar while it takes pictures." Morrison stared at the plane. "It's unarmed." "Completely. Cameras and jammers only. They removed the guns to save weight and extend range." Randall paused. "But here's the thing, Captain. The tech boys finished their tests yesterday. Planes fueled, pre-flight, ready to go. They're waiting for a ferry pilot to take it back to Pearl. And they're all at breakfast." Randall's smile was thin. "Won't be back for another hour." Morrison felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but close. You're talking about stealing a plane. I'm talking about settling a score. Randall's voice went hard. Those Zeros are still out there. Intelligence says they're operating from a forward strip on Bougainville, refueling there before hitting our convoys. That jamming gear works, Captain. I've seen the reports. You could fly right into their nest and they'd never see you coming. I can't shoot them down without guns. No, Randall agreed. But you can find them. Mark their position. Call in a strike package that'll turn that airstrip into a smoking crater. He leaned closer. You can make those bastards pay for what they did. Morrison looked at the F-4 again. His mind was already running calculations. Range. Speed. The jamming equipment would mask his approach, but he'd need to get close, dangerously close, to confirm targets and relay coordinates. It was suicide. It was also the only thing that made sense. If I do this, Morrison said slowly, I'm court-martialed. Career over. Maybe prison. Randall shrugged. Beats living the rest of your life wondering if you could have done something. The chief mechanic pulled a folded map from his pocket and handed it up. Morrison opened it. Red circles marked Japanese positions. One was labeled in pencil, Probable Zero Staging Area, Kita Strip, Bougainville. Unconfirmed. You've got 3 hours before they notice the plane's gone, Randall said. Maybe 4 if you're lucky. After that, they'll scramble fighters to bring you back. Morrison studied the map, his heart pounding now. 3 hours to fly into enemy territory, locate the Zeros, survive long enough to call in coordinates, and get out. No guns. No backup. Just speed, luck, and a piece of experimental technology that might work. Or might get him killed. He thought about Hayes. About Chen. About all of them, spinning into the ocean with their planes on fire. He folded the map. Get me a flight suit, Morrison said. Randall grinned. Already in the cockpit, sir. 20 minutes later, Captain Jake Morrison climbed into the F-4's cockpit, the canopy still warm from the sun. The instruments glowed softly. The twin Allison engines rumbled to life with a sound like distant thunder. He didn't file a flight plan. He didn't radio the tower. He just pushed the throttles forward and felt the plane leap into the sky, climbing fast and clean toward the north, toward Bougainville, toward the men who'd killed his squadron, toward revenge. The ocean slid beneath him in endless blue, broken only by whitecaps and the shadows of clouds. Morrison flew low, 200 feet above the water, just high enough to avoid spray, low enough to stay under most radar sweeps. The F-4 handled like a dream, responsive and light without the weight of guns and ammunition. But every time his hand drifted toward where the trigger should be, he felt naked. This is insane, a voice whispered in his head. You're flying an unarmed plane into enemy airspace to pick a fight with the men who butchered your squadron. He pushed the thought away and checked his instruments. Airspeed, 280 knots. Fuel, 3/4. The jamming equipment hummed softly behind his seat, a black box covered in dials and switches that the tech crew had spent days calibrating. According to the manual he'd skimmed, it emitted a signal that confused enemy radar, made the plane appear smaller, or in the wrong place, or sometimes not there at all. Sometimes. Morrison had no idea if it actually worked. 30 minutes into the flight, he saw the first island, a green smudge on the horizon that grew into jungle-covered mountains. He banked west, following the coastline, eyes scanning for patrol boats or scout planes. The Japanese controlled everything north of the Solomons. He was deep in their territory now. His radio crackled. Any U.S. aircraft, this is Henderson Tower. We have an unauthorized departure, military aircraft F-4, tail number 423. Pilot is ordered to return immediately. Acknowledge. Morrison reached down and switched off the radio. Silence filled the cockpit. Ahead, The water darkened where a current ran between two islands. Morrison checked his map, tracing his finger along the chain. Bougainville was still 90 miles north. At this speed, 20 more minutes. Then what? He didn't have a plan beyond, find the Zeros and don't get shot down. The idea had seemed clearer on the ground, fueled by rage and grief. Up here, alone in the sky with nothing but ocean and enemy territory, it felt thin. But turning back felt worse. He climbed to 5,000 feet as he approached the southern tip of Bougainville. The island was massive. Dense jungle, volcanic peaks, and somewhere in the interior, Japanese bases that intelligence barely knew existed. The strip at Kita was supposed to be on the eastern coast, carved out of the jungle near a natural harbor. Morrison's eyes swept the horizon. There, a scar of brown dirt cutting through green. Narrow. Maybe 3,000 feet long. At the far end, camouflage netting covered what looked like fuel drums and supply crates, and parked in a neat row along the tree line. Zeros. Morrison's breath caught. He counted 6. No, 7. Mitsubishi A-6M fighters, their wings folded, ground crews moving between them like ants. One was being refueled. Another had its engine cowling open. 7 out of 18, Morrison thought grimly. Maybe the rest are airborne. He throttled back, circling wide, staying at altitude. His hand hovered over the radio. All he had to do was call in the coordinates. Henderson could scramble a strike package, dauntless dive bombers, maybe a flight of Wildcats for escort. They'd be here in an hour, and those Zeros would burn. But Morrison didn't reach for the radio. Because something didn't add up. 7 planes. Minimal ground crew. No patrol fighters in the air. For a forward staging base, it was almost deserted. Unless... His eyes narrowed. Unless they're expecting something. Morrison checked his altimeter. The jamming equipment was still running, the indicator light steady green. If it was working, the Japanese radar shouldn't even know he was here. But if it wasn't, if the equipment had failed or if the Japanese had some way to see through it, then he'd just flown straight into a trap. He scanned the sky. Empty. The jungle below showed no movement except wind in the trees. Maybe he was paranoid. Or maybe... The first burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted 200 feet to his left. Black puffs of smoke blossomed in the air, close enough that the concussion rocked the F-4's wings. Morrison's heart slammed into his throat. He yanked the stick hard right, diving, and 2 more flak bursts detonated where he'd just been. They see me. He shoved the throttles to full power and dropped toward the deck, the altimeter unwinding. 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,000. Tracers arced up from the tree line, bright streaks of green and orange that snapped past his canopy. The jamming equipment was useless. They'd been tracking him the whole time. Bait. The realization hit him like ice water. This wasn't a staging base. It was a trap, a handful of Zeros left out in the open to draw in American scouts, with flak guns hidden in the jungle and fighters waiting just over the horizon. He'd flown right into it. Morrison leveled out at 500 feet, jinking left and right as more tracers reached up. The F-4 was fast, but without weapons, he couldn't fight back. All he could do was run. And then he heard them. The growl of engines behind him. He twisted in his seat and saw them. 3 Zeros, diving out of the clouds like hawks, sunlight flashing on their wings. They'd been up there the whole time, waiting. Morrison's blood turned cold. No guns. No gunner. No chance. The lead Zero opened fire, and Morrison threw the F-4 into a violent barrel roll. Bullets stitched the air where he'd been, so close he could hear them crack past. He pulled hard left, then right, trying to stay unpredictable, but the Zeros were faster, more maneuverable. They spread out, boxing him in. He was going to die. Just like the others. No. Morrison's jaw clenched. His hands tightened on the stick. Not like this. He slammed the throttles forward and dove straight toward the ocean, the F-4 screaming as the airspeed indicator climbed past 350 knots. The Zeros followed, tracers chasing him down. The water rushed up, 100 feet, 50, 25, and at the last second, Morrison pulled up so hard his vision grayed, the plane shuddering as it skimmed 10 feet above the waves. The lead Zero tried to follow. Too steep. Too fast. His wing clipped the water. The plane cartwheeled across the surface in a spray of white, disintegrating into pieces that tumbled and sank. One down. But the other two were still on him. Morrison's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them. Couldn't outfight them. The only advantage he had was the F-4's twin engines and the jamming equipment. An idea sparked. Insane. Desperate. He reached back and flipped switches, cranking every dial to maximum. The black box began to whine, a high-pitched sound that made his teeth ache. The indicator light flickered from green to red. This is either brilliant or it's going to explode. Morrison turned toward the island, heading straight for the airstrip. The Zeros followed, closing fast. Ahead, the 7 planes on the ground were clearly visible. Ground crews running. Flak guns swiveling. And then Morrison's radar jamming equipment, overloaded and screaming, began to broadcast a signal so powerful it lit up every radar screen on the island like a supernova. The Japanese radar operators saw it at the same moment, a massive signal, impossible to miss, screaming across their scopes like a flight of 50 bombers. Alarms blared across the base. Officers shouted into radios. Every gun on the island swung toward the incoming blip. Toward Morrison. But the signal wasn't coming from where Morrison actually was. The overloaded jamming equipment was spewing electromagnetic noise in every direction, creating ghost images on the radar, phantom planes that appeared to be everywhere and nowhere, multiplying across the screens in a spreading cloud of false contacts. To the defenders below, it looked like an entire American strike force was bearing down on them from 3 directions at once. Chaos erupted. Flak guns opened fire at empty sky. Ground crews abandoned the Zeros and sprinted for cover. The 2 Zeros chasing Morrison suddenly broke off, their pilots receiving frantic radio calls to intercept the bombers approaching from the west, bombers that didn't exist. Morrison watched them peel away, climbing hard, and for a split second he couldn't believe it had worked. Then the jamming equipment caught fire. Smoke poured from the black box behind his seat, acrid and thick. The cockpit filled with the stench of burning electronics. Morrison coughed, eyes watering, and yanked the emergency release. The box tumbled out of the plane, trailing smoke, and splashed into the ocean below. The phantom signals vanished from the Japanese radar. But the damage was done. Morrison was alone over the airstrip, flying straight through the middle of a hornet's nest, and every eye on the island had just realized they'd been tricked. He had seconds. Morrison armed his cameras and dove. The F-4 plummeted toward the runway at 400 knots, the engine screaming, the whole frame shaking. He leveled out at 200 feet, skimming directly over the parked Zeros. The cameras clicked in rapid sequence, capturing everything: tail numbers, markings, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, the exact layout of the base. Tracer fire erupted from every direction. Bullets punched through the F-4's left wing, tearing metal. A round shattered the canopy above Morrison's head, and glass exploded across the cockpit. He ducked instinctively, shards cutting his face, hot wind roaring through the gap. The end of the runway rushed up. Morrison pulled back hard, climbing vertical, and a flak burst detonated directly beneath him. The shock wave lifted the plane like a toy, flipping it sideways. Morrison fought the controls, muscles screaming, and somehow leveled out at 1,000 feet. But the left engine was on fire. Oil streamed back along the fuselage. The temperature gauge redlined. Morrison's training took over. He feathered the prop, cut fuel to the burning engine, and activated the extinguisher. White foam sprayed across the nacelle. The fire went out. But he was flying on one engine now, slow and vulnerable. Below, the 2 Zeros that had broken off were coming back, realizing too late that they'd been duped. Morrison saw them climbing toward him, fast and angry. "I'm not going to make it." He turned south, nursing the remaining engine, coaxing every ounce of power from it. The F-4 shuddered, limping through the sky at barely 200 knots. The Zeros would catch him in minutes. Morrison's hand found the radio. "Screw the court-martial. Screw everything. Henderson Tower, this is Captain Morrison, F-4, tail 423. I need immediate strike package on my position. Grid coordinates November 7 for Echo. Confirm you copy. Static. Henderson, do you copy? I have positive target identification. 7. Correction. 9-0 fighters on the ground. Fuel and ammo depot. Request immediate. Morrison." The voice that cut through was sharp, furious. "Commander Harding, the air boss. Where the hell are you? You stole a goddamn plane. You're—" "Sir, I'm over Kita Strip, Bougainville. I've got camera confirmation of a Japanese fighter base. I need a strike now." A pause. Then, "You're where?" "I found them, sir. The Zeros that hit us. They're here. Send everything you've got." Another pause, longer this time. Morrison could almost hear the gears turning in Harding's head, the regulations, the protocols, the fact that Morrison was probably insane. But also the fact that Morrison had just handed them a target. "Stand by," Harding said tightly. Morrison didn't have time to stand by. The first Zero opened fire, and bullets tore through the F-4's tail. The rudder shredded. The plane yawed hard left, almost spinning, and Morrison fought to keep it straight. His altitude dropped, 800 feet, 600, 400. The ocean rose up to meet him. Not yet. Morrison shoved the throttle to the stop, pushing the single engine past its limits. The temperature gauge went into the red. The airframe groaned. But the plane held together, skimming just above the waves. The Zeros dove after him. And then, from the south, Morrison heard the most beautiful sound in the world. "Morrison, this is Diamondback Leader. We're inbound your position, 2 minutes out. Hold on, son." 8 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, escorted by 6 F-4F Wildcats. They'd already been in the air, already on patrol. Harding had diverted them the second Morrison called in the coordinates. Morrison felt something break open in his chest, relief, gratitude, something close to tears. "Diamondback Leader, targets are 9 Zeros on the ground, fuel depot on the north side of the strip. Flak positions in the tree line. You're cleared hot." "Copy that. Get clear, Morrison." But Morrison wasn't clear. The Zeros were still on him, still firing. One more burst and the F-4 would come apart. He did the only thing he could think of. He turned back toward the island. The Zeros, confused, followed him, and flew straight into the American strike package. The Wildcats hit them like a hammer. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. 1 Zero exploded in midair, a ball of orange flame. The other tried to run, but 2 Wildcats boxed him in, and their guns tore him apart. Morrison pulled up, climbing away from the chaos, and watched as the Dauntless rolled into their dives. They fell like angels of death, one after another, 1,000-pound bombs slung beneath their wings. The first bomb hit the fuel dump, and a fireball erupted that climbed 500 feet into the air. The second and third bombs walked across the runway, cratering it. The fourth hit a parked Zero directly, and the plane vanished in the blast. Morrison circled at 2,000 feet, his battered F-4 shaking, smoke trailing from the dead engine, and watched Kita Strip burn. Every Zero on the ground was destroyed. Every fuel drum. Every ammunition bunker. The base that had killed his squadron was gone. Morrison didn't remember much of the flight back. He remembered the Wildcats forming up around him, escorting his crippled plane like an honor guard. He remembered Commander Harding's voice on the radio, tight and unreadable. "You're cleared to land, Captain. Medical standing by." He remembered seeing Henderson Field appear on the horizon, the runway stretching out like salvation. And he remembered the landing gear refusing to extend. The hydraulics were shot, shredded by gunfire. Morrison tried the manual release. Nothing. He tried the emergency backup. Still nothing. "Gear's not coming down," he reported, his voice flat. Too tired to feel the fear he should be feeling. "Copy that, Morrison," Harding said. "Foam the runway. Bring her in on the belly." Morrison lined up his approach. The F-4 was barely responding now, the controls sluggish, the single engine coughing. He could see fire trucks racing along the taxiway, could see the white foam spraying across the tarmac. He cut the engine at 100 feet and glided in. The F-4 hit hard, belly scraping concrete with a shriek of tortured metal. Sparks sprayed in twin rooster tails. The plane skidded, slewing sideways, and Morrison braced against the harness as the world spun. The left wingtip caught the ground and the plane pivoted, groaning, before finally sliding to a stop in a cloud of smoke and foam. Silence. Morrison sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, and realized he was shaking. The canopy was wrenched open. Hands reached in, pulling him out. His legs buckled when they hit the ground, and someone caught him. Chief Randall, grinning through the soot on his face. "You crazy son of a bitch," Randall said, laughing. "You actually did it." Morrison couldn't answer. He just stared at the wrecked F-4, at the bullet holes stitched across the fuselage, at the shredded tail and the blackened engine. He'd flown that thing for 3 hours. One engine. No guns. No armor. And he'd survived. They took him to the medical tent, where a Navy doctor poked at the cuts on his face and declared him miraculously intact, considering. Morrison barely heard him. He sat on the cot, staring at his hands, trying to make sense of what he'd done. Commander Harding arrived 20 minutes later. The air boss stood in the tent entrance, arms crossed, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "That was the stupidest, most reckless thing I've ever seen a pilot do." Morrison met his eyes. "Yes, sir. You stole a plane. Flew unauthorized into enemy territory. Engaged superior forces without weapons." Harding's jaw tightened. "You violated about a dozen regulations. I should have you arrested." "Yes, sir." Another pause. "The strike package you called in destroyed 9 enemy fighters, 2 fuel depots, and a forward staging base intelligence didn't even know existed. The photos from your cameras confirmed that Kita Strip was the primary refueling point for raids on our convoys. Taking it out probably saved 100 American lives." Morrison said nothing. Harding stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Your squadron didn't die for nothing, Captain. You made sure of that." Something broke in Morrison's chest, a dam he'd been holding back since yesterday. His eyes burned. He looked away, jaw clenched, fighting it. Harding put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, son. Stupid, but good." He turned to leave, then stopped at the tent flap. "For what it's worth. Hayes would be proud." They held a memorial service 3 days later. 12 white crosses on the edge of the airfield, facing the ocean. The entire base turned out. Pilots, mechanics, ground crew. A chaplain spoke words Morrison didn't really hear. Someone played taps on a battered bugle. Morrison stood at the front, still and silent, and said goodbye to men whose voices he would never hear again. When it was over, when everyone had drifted away, he stayed. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Morrison stared at the crosses, at the names burned into the wood with a soldering iron. Lieutenant Commander James Hayes, Lieutenant Daniel Chen, Lieutenant Anthony Rodriguez, Ensign Peter Kowalski. 12 names. 12 ghosts. "I got them," Morrison said quietly, to the wind and the crosses and the memory of the men who weren't there to hear it. "I got them for you." The ocean whispered against the shore. Morrison stood there until the stars came out, until the crosses were just shadows in the dark. Then he turned and walked back toward the base, toward the planes and the war that would keep going with or without him. Behind him, the wind rattled through the memorial, carrying the names of the dead out over the water, toward home, toward the sky, toward whatever waited beyond. 3 weeks later, Morrison received new orders. He wasn't court-martialed, wasn't sent stateside. Instead, they gave him a new squadron. 12 fresh pilots, straight from training, who'd heard the story and wanted to fly with a man who'd flown an unarmed plane into hell and come back. Morrison stood on the tarmac, watching them taxi their brand-new TBF Avengers into position, and felt the weight on his chest ease, just a little. The ghosts would always be there. But so would he. And as long as he was flying, as long as he was fighting, his squadron, all of them living and dead, would never be forgotten. Morrison climbed into his cockpit, strapped in, and pushed the throttle forward. The plane lifted into the dawn sky, climbing toward the light, toward the war, toward the future. And somewhere in the wind and the engine roar, he swore he could hear them, Hayes and Chen and Rodriguez and all the rest, laughing, cheering, telling him to fly faster. So he did.